Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in sending condolences to the family and friends of Sislin Faye Allen, who died earlier this week. She was the UK's first black female police officer, and she served in the Metropolitan Police. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure colleagues will also want to join me in wishing the England football team the best of luck for tonight's semi-final against Denmark. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
John McMillan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we hear a great deal in this place about the rule of law and injustice. Can the Prime Minister tell me what he's going to do about the injustice that my constituents in Falkirk, indeed families up and down the UK, are facing every day because of the retrospective loan charge that is fast turning into the next post office scandal? The hounding by HMRC, clearly out of control, accountable to no one, has managed to hoodwink, mislead his own Treasury ministers. And now, according to the head of HMRC, the retrospective loan charge appears to be without any legal basis or justification. Therefore, will the Prime Minister accept this matter needs further and immediate investigation?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely aware, as I think all colleagues are around the House, of the pain suffered by those who entered into loan charge schemes, and I think alas, that they were misguided to do so. But I think that the line taken by the Treasury, I'm afraid, is right on this.
Let's go to John Stevenson. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, there is more that unites us than divides us is very true of the United Kingdom. However, improved connectivity is vital to ensuring we remain united. The government's recent interim connectivity review has suggested some improvements. If this is really going to happen, then improvements must be made to the A75, the A69, and to the extension of the Borders Railway. Does the Prime Minister support such investment, and what is the timescale for such investment?
I thank my honourable friend for his excellent question. I think he should not have too long to wait for the final recommendations from Sir Peter Hendy about the A75 and other great features of union connectivity which this government hopes to support. But we've already agreed £5 million from the UK and the Scottish governments to support the extension of the Edinburgh-Tweedbank Borders Railway to Carlisle.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about the 7/7 anniversary? I remember where I was on that day and will never forget it. I'm sure that's the same for everybody, and we will never forget all those affected, especially the family and friends of all those who died. Can I join the Prime Minister in his comments about Faye Allen as well, and also about football, and wish the very best of luck to the England football team this evening. I'm sure the whole country, with the possible exception of the Conservative MP for Ashfield, will be watching this evening and cheering England on. Mr. Speaker, can I also extend a special welcome to the new member for Batley and Spen? And will members opposite forgive me if I just turn round to look at the new member for Batley and Spen as she sits there on these benches beneath the plaque to Jo Cox, her sister. And that's a special and emotional moment for all of us on these benches. And I think for everybody across this House, it takes incredible courage and bravery to stand in that constituency and to sit on these benches beneath that plaque. Mr. Speaker, we all want our economy to open and to get back to normal. The question is whether we do it in a controlled way or a chaotic way. The Health Secretary told the House yesterday that under the government's plan, infections could go as high as 100,000 a day. Now, a number of key questions fall from that. First, if infections reach that level, 100,000 per day, what does the Prime Minister expect the number of hospitalisations, deaths, and the number of people with long COVID will be in that eventuality?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there are a number of projections, and they're available from the SPI-M graphs, but it's certainly true, Mr. Speaker, that we are seeing a wave of cases because of the Delta variant. But scientists are also absolutely clear that we have severed the link between infection and serious disease and death. And currently there are only a 30th of the deaths that we were seeing at an equivalent position in previous waves of this pandemic. And that has been made possible thanks to the vaccine rollout, the fastest of any European country. And I think what people would like to hear from the party opposite, because I wasn't quite clear from that opening question, is whether or not they support the progress that this country is intending to make on July the 19th or not, Mr. Speaker. He says it's reckless to go ahead. Does that mean he's opposing it?
Mr. Speaker, we know that the link between infection rates and deaths has been weakened, but it hasn't been broken. And the Prime Minister must, and he certainly should know the answer to the question that I asked him. That he won't answer it here in the House hardly inspires confidence in his plan. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear why infection rates are so high. Because the Prime Minister let the Delta, or we can call it the Johnson variant, into the country. And let's be clear why the number of cases will surge so quickly, because he is taking all protections off in one go. That is reckless. The SAGE papers yesterday, Mr. Speaker, make clear that with high infection rates, there's a greater chance of new variants emerging, greater pressure on the NHS, more people will get long COVID, and test and trace will be less effective. Knowing all that, is the Prime Minister really comfortable with a plan that means 100,000 people catching this virus every day and everything that entails?
Mr. Speaker, I really think we need to hear from what the Honourable Gentleman what he actually supports. We will continue with a balanced and reasonable approach. And I've given the reasons. This country has rolled out the fastest vaccination programme anywhere in Europe. The vaccines provide more than 90% protection against hospitalisation, both of them, Mr. Speaker. By the 19th of July, we will have vaccinated, every adult will have been offered one vaccination. Everybody over 40, Mr. Speaker, will have been offered two vaccinations. That is an extraordinary achievement. That's allowing us to go ahead. Now, last week, Mr. Speaker, or earlier this week, he seemed to support opening up, getting rid of the 1 metre rule. He seemed to support getting back into nightclubs and getting back into pubs without masks, Mr. Speaker. But if he doesn't support it, perhaps he could clear it up now. Is it reckless or not, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, we should open up in a controlled way. Keeping baseline protections such as masks on public transport, improving ventilation, making sure the track and trace system remains effective, and ensuring proper payments for self-isolation. The Prime Minister can't just wish away the practical problems that 100,000 infections a day are going to cause. Can't wish them away. The next obvious one is the huge number of people who will be asked to isolate. If there are 100,000 infections a day, that means hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people are going to be pinged to isolate. The Financial Times estimates this morning that could be around 2 million people per week. The Mail says 3.5 million people a week. Either way, it's a massive number. It means huge disruption to families and businesses just as the summer holidays begin. So we know what the FT thinks. We know what the Mail thinks, what their estimates are. Can the Prime Minister tell us how many people does he expect will be asked to isolate if infection rates continue to rise at this rate?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank everybody who self-isolates. They're doing the right thing. They're a vital part of this country's protection against the disease. And what we will be doing is moving away from self-isolation towards testing in the course of the next few weeks. And that is the prudent approach, because we will have, Mr. Speaker, vaccinated even more people. But what he can't explain, he can't have it both ways. He says it's reckless to open up, Mr. Speaker, and yet he attacks self-isolation, Mr. Speaker, which is one of the key protections that this country has. Let me ask him again. On Monday, he seemed to say he was in favour. He seemed to say he was in favour of opening up on July the 19th. Now he's saying it's reckless. Which is it, Mr. Speaker?
Maybe I can help a little, just to remind us that it's Prime Minister's questions. If we want opposition questions, we'll need to change standing up. Yes.
The question was simply how many people are going to be asked to self-isolate if there's 100,000 infections a day, and he won't answer it. And we know why he won't answer it and pretends I'm asking a different question. He ignored the problems in schools. Now there's 700,000 children off per week because he ignored it. Now he's ignoring the next big problem that's heading down the track and going to affect millions of people who have to self-isolate. Now, it won't feel like Freedom Day to those who have to isolate, when they're having to cancel their holidays, when they can't go to the pub or even to their kids' sports day. And it won't feel like Freedom Day, Prime Minister, to the businesses who are already warning of carnage because of the loss of staff and customers. It must be obvious, with case rates that high, his plan risks undermining the track and trace system that he spent billions and billions of pounds on. Prime Minister, there are already too many stories of people deleting the NHS app. He must have seen those stories. And they're doing it because they can see what is coming down the track. Now, of course, we don't support that, Mr. Speaker, but under his plan, it's entirely predictable. What is the Prime Minister going to do to stop people deleting the NHS track because they can see precisely what he can't see, which is millions of them are going to be pinged this summer to self-isolate?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we're going to continue with the programme of self-isolation for long as that is necessary. I thank all those who are doing it. But, of course, what we're also doing is moving to a system of testing rather than self-isolation. And we can do that because of the massive rollout of the vaccine programme. And what I'm still not, I think about the fourth or fifth time, Mr. Speaker, it's still not clear whether he's actually in favour of this country moving forward to step 4 on the basis of the massive rollout of vaccine. And yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, this is unlike the law, where you can attack from lots of different positions at once. To oppose, you must have a credible and clear alternative. And I simply do not hear that. Is he in favour of us moving forward, yes or no? It's completely impossible to tell.
Once again, it's Prime Minister's questions and the Prime Minister answers questions. Keir Starmer.
If he stopped mumbling and listened, he'd have heard the answer the first time. We want to open in a controlled way and keep in line baseline protections that can keep down infections, like mandatory face masks on public transport. Now, we know that will protect people, reduce the speed of the virus and the spread of the virus, and it won't harm the economy. It's common sense. Why can't the Prime Minister see that?
Prime Minister.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, we can see that it's common sense for people in confined spaces to wear a face mask out of respect and courtesy to others, but such as on the tube. But what we're doing, Mr. Speaker, is cautiously, prudently moving from legal diktat to allowing people to take personal responsibility for their actions. And that is the right way forward, Mr. Speaker. And I must say that if really that is the only difference between us, if he supports absolutely everything else, so opening pubs, opening nightclubs, getting rid of the 1 metre rule, getting people back to work, and it's all about whether the difference between making face masks mandatory or advisory on the tube. If that is the only difference between us, Mr. Speaker, then that is good news. But I'd like to hear him clarify that.
Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, he agrees it's common sense because it protects the public, but he won't make it mandatory. It's ridiculous. It's clear what this is all about. He's lost a health secretary. He's lost a by-election, and he's getting flack from his own MPs. So he's doing what he always does, crashing over to the other side of the aisle, chasing headlines and coming up with a plan that hasn't been thought through. We all want restrictions lifted, we want our economy open, and we want to get back to normal. But we've been here too many times before, isn't it the case that once again, instead of a careful, controlled approach, we're heading for a summer of chaos and confusion?
Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, is the answer to that. These are, of course, these are difficult decisions. They need to be taken in a balanced way, and that's what we're doing. And throughout the pandemic, to do all these things, frankly, Mr. Speaker, takes a great deal of drive and it takes a great deal of leadership to get things done. And if we'd followed his advice, Mr. Speaker, if we'd followed his advice, we would still be in the European Medicines Agency, and we would never. We would never have rolled out the vaccines as fast. If we'd followed his advice, Mr. Speaker, we would never have got schools open again with all the damage to kids' education. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to him, we would not now be proceeding cautiously, pragmatically, sensibly to reopen our society and our economy and give people back the chance to enjoy the freedoms they love. We're getting on with taking the tough decisions to take this country forward, Mr. Speaker. We vaccinate, they vacillate, we inoculate, Mr. Speaker, while they're invertebrate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I visited Penketh South Primary School in Warrington to talk to Year 6 children about how we can generate cleaner energy in the future. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that as well as backing electric vehicle production in the North West, there's a great opportunity to shift towards low-carbon hydrogen by providing support for projects such as HyNet North West, which by 2030 will secure thousands of green jobs in the North West, as well as by cutting emissions to the same level as taking 4 million cars off the roads?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the North West, in addition to the rest of this country, can be a world leader, will be a world leader in hydrogen technology, and I think the HyNet project is an excellent example. We've already put 45 million into supporting the HyNet project, kick-starting hydrogen capture and storage, and I thank him for his support.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish England all the best for the football match tonight against Denmark, and I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the tragedy of the bombing of 7/7 that we all remember so vividly. And also, Mr. Speaker, yesterday was the 33rd anniversary of the Piper Alpha disaster, where 167 people cruelly lost their lives. And our thoughts are very much with the friends and family that are still grieving over the terrors of that event. And finally, before I move on, this is also Srebrenica Memorial Week, and we should be remembering those that have suffered at genocide, whether that be in Bosnia, in the Holocaust, in Rwanda and many other places. And perhaps the Prime Minister will meet with me to discuss how we can help the Srebrenica charity here in the UK. Mr. Speaker, this week the Tory government introduced its so-called Electoral Integrity Bill. In reality, the bill is designed to do anything but increase the integrity of our elections. It is a solution in desperate search of a problem that simply does not exist. What the bill will do is to impose for the first time Trumpian voter ID laws in the UK. The Electoral Reform Society says it could lead to voter disenfranchisement on an industrial scale. Disenfranchising people from working class communities, BME communities and others already marginalised in society, creating barriers to vote. Prime Minister, why is this Tory government trying to rob people of their democratic right to vote?
Mr. Speaker, what we're trying to protect is the democratic right of people to have a one-person, one-vote system. And I'm afraid that I have personal experience. I remember vividly what used to go on in Tower Hamlets, and I think it is important that we move to some sort of voter ID, and plenty of other countries have it, and I think it's eminently sensible, and people, I think, will be reassured that their votes matter, and that's what this bill is about.
Goodness gracious, Prime Minister, come on. There were 34 allegations of impersonation in 2019. This is a problem that does not exist. It is a British Prime Minister seeking to make it harder to vote because it's easier to get re-elected if the government can choose their voters, rather than letting the voters choose their government. Mr. Speaker, 3.5 million people in the United Kingdom do not have a form of photo ID. 11 million people do not have a passport or driver's licence. These millions of people will be directly impacted by seeing their right to vote curtailed. And it's not just the opposition saying this. Members of the Prime Minister's own party have called his plans an illogical and illiberal solution to a non-existent problem. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister withdraw these vote-rigging proposals immediately, or he will continue down the path of being a tin pot dictator?
Right. Well, Mr. Speaker, look, I think he's making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, if I may respectfully suggest. Councils will be under an obligation to provide free photo ID to anybody who wants it, and I do think it reasonable to protect the public in our elections from the idea of voter fraud. Nobody wants to see it. No, and by the way, I don't think that elections in this country should be in any way clouded or contaminated by the suspicion of voter fraud, and that's what we're trying to prevent.
Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I was pleased to see my right honourable friend in Cornwall for a very successful G7 summit. Whilst I know he didn't manage to get to South East Cornwall, I can assure him that Looe is a very beautiful coastal town. The problem is Looe floods regularly. Will my right honourable friend speak to government departments to get this sorted? Through my honourable friend, just thank again the people of Cornwall, South East Cornwall, everybody of Cornwall. It was a wonderful hospitality that the G7 had, and I assure her that I'm aware of the problem of the flooding in Looe, and I can tell her that my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, has met Cornwall Council to discuss the matter, and we will do everything we can to sort it out.
You'll have me.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to add my voice on behalf of the Albion Party to the comments about 7/7. On the morning of 7/7, I was in a meeting at UCLH A&E as the information started coming through, and I would pay tribute to every single one of those frontline staff that I worked alongside on that day. It was a long shift, and it was a long walk home that evening. The Prime Minister talks about vaccines. Accurate surveillance is really important as well. It's equally as important. And on the 15th of March, the Department of Health and Social Care Minister, Lord Bethell, on Twitter said that Omega Diagnostics and Mologic were in line for 2 million lateral flow device order per day by the end of May. It promised jobs and security. So can the Prime Minister explain why his government is undermining the superior domestic diagnostics tests while propping up discredited Chinese imports to the tune of £3 billion?
I thank the honourable gentleman. I don't think that's an entirely fair characterisation of what the government is doing. On the contrary, we have worked night and day to build up our domestic lateral flow capacity and continue to do so.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, last week President Xi cheerily threatened that any foreigners attempting to influence China will have their heads bashed against the Great Wall of Steel. And of course he's still in denial about human rights violations and the genocides in Xinjiang and Tibet, as recognised by this House, and as a result of which 5 of us remained sanctioned. So will the Prime Minister therefore support our motion to be debated in this House next Thursday, calling for a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics, incredibly awarded to Beijing, until and unless this dangerous regime abides by basic international standards of decency?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, but this country has led the world in condemning human rights abuses in Xinjiang, in putting sanctions on those responsible, in holding companies to account that import goods made with forced labour in Xinjiang. And I will certainly consider the proposal debated, but I must say that I'm instinctively and always have been against sporting boycotts, Mr.
And the Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and others on the anniversaries being marked today. Now, this Sunday, 11th July, marks 2 years since the Government committed to reforming a cruel aspect of the welfare system, which forces terminally ill people to prove that they have 6 months or less to live before they are granted fast access to benefits. And the Motor Neuron Disease Association Marie Curie estimate in that time 7,000 people have died waiting for a decision on their benefits claim. And with the pandemic and the NHS managing that and the backlog of diseases, this situation will only become more acute. When will the Government publish its review and finally scrap the 6-month rule as it has committed to do so?
I'm grateful. Thank you, the Honourable Lady. I'm aware of the issue that she's raised. To the best of my knowledge, we are making that change, but I will write to her as soon as I have that information.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Whilst the extension of the grace period for the supply of chilled meat from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is welcome, Lord Frost is entirely right to say that it amounts in truth to no more than a temporary sticking plaster. So can my right honourable friend please confirm that unless the European Union adopts a more proportionate approach to the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol, this country will do whatever it is necessary, legislative or otherwise, to fix the problem permanently?
My right honourable friend is sadly completely right in his analysis. There remain very serious problems in the what I believe is the misapplication, the excessively legally purist application of that deal and of that protocol. And what we are hoping for is some progress from the European Commission, some repairs that I think that they should make to the way this is working. But to echo what he has said, we certainly rule nothing out in our approach.
Angela Crawley.
Prime Minister, 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, and therefore does the Prime Minister agree that parents' grief for this profound loss is not an illness? Therefore, parents should receive formal miscarriage leave rather than resort to sick pay or unpaid leave if their pregnancy miscarriage occurs before 24 weeks. Will the Prime Minister support my private member's bill and introduce paid miscarriage leave for parents?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I sympathise deeply with anybody who's suffered the loss of a baby by miscarriage, of course. And what I can tell her is that we did introduce in 2020 paid parental bereavement leave, but that entitles those who lose a child after 24 weeks of pregnancy to some payment. But of course, nothing I can say, and no payment we could make would be any consolation to those who experience a miscarriage in that way.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Serious Fraud Office achieved a rare success in Southwark Crown Court in April with a successful prosecution of GPT special projects, which resulted in £28 million of penalties for corruption. The key whistleblower in this case was my constituent Ian Foxley, without whom the prosecution would never have happened. Yet he's been totally hung out to dry by the Serious Fraud Office, despite 10 years of financial devastation. Does my right honourable friend agree that unless we properly compensate whistleblowers, they simply will not come forward? And would he consider making a payment out of the £28 million received by the HM Treasury to compensate him for his losses?
Well, I thank him for his excellent question. I want to thank Mr Foxley for his whistleblowing, because he has seen justice done. The trouble is we don't normally compensate whistleblowers in the way that he recommends, but I know that my right honourable friend, the Solicitor General, has offered to meet my honourable friend to discuss the matter further.
Bell Ribeiro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On Monday, we celebrated the 73rd birthday of the NHS, one of the very best things about our country. Now, many of us on this side of the House and our constituents remain committed to protect the fundamental right of universal healthcare free at the point of delivery. But this government remains a constant threat to our public health service. No staff pay rise, a 25% cut in the number of mental health beds, and the widespread sell-off of GP practices like the Edith Cavell surgery in my constituency to American private insurance giant Centene. And also, just to mention, the health and care bill, which will only open the doors for privatisation wider. Why is the Prime Minister continuing to eviscerate our most essential public services? And why won't he listen to the thousands of essential workers who demonstrated on Saturday to end NHS privatisation, end chronic underfunding and understaffing, and keep the NHS public?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think with great respect to the lady opposite, member opposite, I don't think I've ever heard a question that was more inversely related to reality. This is a government. This is a government that from the beginning invested the biggest amount in the NHS for a generation. Then in the last year we put another £92 billion, Mr. Speaker, into frontline care. We've increased nurses' pay starting pay by 12.8% over the last 3 years. And above all, Mr. Speaker, we're not only building 48 more hospitals, but there are another 59,000 people working in the NHS this year than there were this time last year. This is a government that is putting our NHS first.
Let's go to Kate Griffiths. Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House welcomes the fantastic news of Nissan's investment in an electric battery gigafactory in Sunderland. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that batteries are only part of the solution in pursuit of net zero by 2050, and that zero carbon hydrogen combustion engines, such as those recently developed by Midlands-based JCB, have an important role to play in our country's decarbonisation plans?
Minister.
My honourable friend is completely right, because the investments that we're seeing just in the last week or so, the Sunderland investment by Nissan, the gigafactory in Sunderland, what Stellantis are doing at Ellesmere Port, these are tremendously exciting for battery-powered vehicles. It's fantastic, but we must not forget hydrogen, Mr. Speaker. As I said in an earlier answer, we want this country to be a world leader in hydrogen technology as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister is aware of the fatal and serious accidents road accidents that have taken place on St Albans Road and Redbourne Road in my constituency. Could the Prime Minister advise the House and advise me on what more the government is doing to improve road safety, not just in the case of fatal accidents, but often where there are serious accidents or near misses, because this is an issue that's of growing concern to many of my constituents and I believe to many across the country.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's right to raise this. Although those who've been killed or seriously injured on the roads has been coming down over a long period of time, it is vital that we invest in this. We put another £100 million through the Safer Roads Fund to invest in 50 of the most dangerous stretches on A roads, and I also draw his attention to the Think campaign, which can play a huge role in reducing deaths and serious injuries on our roads.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To their bitter disappointment, and despite the assurances given during the fire safety bill that it would do so, the building safety bill published on Monday does little to help the hundreds of thousands of leaseholders who right now face financial ruin as a result of the building safety crisis. My question to the Prime Minister is a simple one. Why is his government seemingly intent on failing to honour the commitments given to those leaseholders and members of this House by refusing to legislate to fully protect all the blameless victims of this scandal?
Right. But that's not accurate, Mr. Speaker. We are continuing to support all those who have to remediate their buildings, and I just remind you the £5 billion that we've provided is 5 times, Mr. Speaker, what Labour offered to support in their last manifesto, and we will make sure that all the leaseholders, people who have suffered from the consequences of the Grenfell conflagration, do get the advice and the support they need.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will recognise the huge service done by independent hospices to those at the end of their lives, to their families, and to the NHS, because these people would likely otherwise be in hospital. He will also understand the huge impact that the COVID pandemic has had on the fundraising capacity of these hospice charities. So can I ask him to consider carefully and personally the case that is being made by independent hospices for greater government support for their clinical costs, costs which, if they were no longer there, would undoubtedly be borne by the taxpayer and by the hard-pressed NHS?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's totally right to draw attention to the incredible selfless work of hospices up and down the country, charitable hospices. They do receive £350 million of government funding annually. He's right to draw attention to the particular difficulties they've had in fundraising, and that's this year over the pandemic, and that's why they've received an additional £257 million in national grant funding arrangements.
Let's go to Imran Hussain. Imran.
Mr. Speaker, in January, the Prime Minister promised me that he would listen to the calls of those that the government had excluded from vital support to protect their jobs, businesses, and incomes during the coronavirus pandemic. Yet over the last 6 months, many of my constituents are still coming to tell me that they have been shut off and ignored, and millions across the country continue to be excluded. So I have to ask the Prime Minister, why did he give those who have been excluded false hope instead of the support they desperately needed?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman. Of course, I know how tough it has been for millions of people up and down the country. I know how tough it has been for business. But that's why this government put in an extraordinary £407 billion to support jobs and livelihoods across the country throughout the pandemic. And the single most important thing we can do now for the individuals, for the families that he represents and that he's rightly talking about today, is to help our country to get back on its feet by cautiously opening up in the way that we are on July the 19th, if we can take that step, which I very much hope that we will. I hope that it may command the support, if not of the Leader of the Opposition, then at least of him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The River Test is one of the finest chalk streams in the world, but since May, diesel has been spilling into the river. What matters most is that the flow is stopped and that there is an effective clean-up. But there are many agencies involved, which has made a coordinated response challenging. Please will my right honourable friend make sure the Environment Agency, Natural England, Southern Water, local authorities and DEFRA are all involved to solve this environmental catastrophe together.
I thank my right honourable friend. She's completely right. All those bodies are involved, but the lead agency is the Environment Agency. I know that they're in touch with her, and I must say I have a very high regard for them and for their work.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the Prime Minister actually welcomed the new member, the honourable member for Batley and Spen, but perhaps you'd want to correct the record after this. They say where there's a will, there's a way, and the public will clearly welcome the government's move to introduce emergency legislation for pubs and bars tomorrow to be able to stay open on Sundays later. However, the public will wonder why tomorrow that the member for Delyn will be allowed to return to this House and not subject to a recall, despite being a serious case of sexual harassment. And actually the public doesn't understand why there should be one rule for Conservative MPs and another for the rest of us. So therefore will the Prime Minister allow time tomorrow for a motion to close this loophole and make him subject of a recall?
Minister.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, the gentleman in question has the sanction has come to an end, and secondly, he is in error. The gentleman opposite is in error. He is not a Conservative MP.
David Davis.
Mr. Speaker, this year thousands of children will die because of the government's dramatic cuts in international aid. Top lawyers in the country advise us that this policy is unlawful and it's never been presented to this House for approval. When he was previously asked by my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield, he suggested that the estimates vote would be the appropriate vote, but that does not allow us to increase the amount of spending on this aid. So I ask the Prime Minister again, when are we going to get a binding vote on the government's aid policy?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but I'm assured by my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, that the House was given a chance to vote on this matter on the estimates votes, but mysteriously chose not to.
Tamarjit Singh Desi.
Thank you so much. Mr. Speaker, my grandmother, whom I love dearly, was lying on a hospital deathbed, and none of us were allowed to be there to comfort her in her final moments. I couldn't even carry her coffin on my shoulders. I also had to endure the agony of watching alone online the funeral of my uncle, my fun-loving uncle, and we were not there to comfort my brother-in-law's father, who had somehow contracted COVID in a Slough care home during his final moments. All this because we followed government guidance. Having experienced such painful personal sacrifices, like many others, imagine our collective disgust when, in order to curry favour with the Prime Minister's chief advisor, we see psychophantic, spineless, hypocritical government ministers lining up to defend the indefensible, saying it's time to move on, with some even having the gall to tell us that they too go for a long drive when they need to get their eyesight tested. What an absolute disgrace, and they shall be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. So when is the Prime Minister finally going to apologise to the nation for not mustering up some courage and integrity, for doing the honourable thing and sacking his chief advisor, who so shamelessly flouted his own government guidance, so that he could have regained that lost public trust and confidence, and he could have demonstrated that it's not one rule for him and his elite chums and another for the rest of us plebs.
Well said.
It is very emotional, Prime Minister.
Perhaps the best thing I can say, Mr. Speaker, is how deeply I think the government, everybody sympathises with those who have gone through the suffering described by the gentleman opposite. And no one can, who hasn't been through something like that, can imagine what it must feel like to be deprived of the ability to mourn properly, to hold the hands of a loved one in their last moments in the way that the honourable gentleman describes. And I know how much sympathy there will be with him. I take his criticisms most sincerely of the government and everything that we have done, but all I can say, we have tried throughout this pandemic to minimise human suffering, to minimise loss of life, and for where we have, and for, as I've said before, when he asks me to apologise, I do. I apologise for the suffering that the people of this country have endured, and all I can say is that nothing I can say or do can take back the lost lives, the lost time spent with loved ones that he describes, and I'm deeply, deeply sorry for that.
Point of order, Samuel Wilson.
Speaker, on the 23rd of June, my colleague for Lagan Valley asked the Prime Minister whether Article 6 of the Act of Union 1800 had been impliedly repealed when the protocol was approved by the Northern Ireland Protocol was approved by the House of Commons. The Prime Minister answered emphatically no. Last Thursday in the High Court, responding to a case made by the government's lawyers that the Northern Ireland Protocol was not in conflict with the Act of Union because Article 6, which guaranteed equal trade across the United Kingdom, had been impliedly repealed when the Withdrawal Act was passed through the House of Commons. Mr Justice Colton agreed that indeed Article 6 of the Act of Union had been overridden by the passing of the Withdrawal Acts here in the House of Commons. Now here's the point, Mr Speaker. The government's case was approved, presented and argued before the Prime Minister gave the answer to my colleague in the House of Commons. And that answer, therefore, must have been a misleading answer to the House. And I want to know whether the Prime Minister can be called to apologise for that misleading answer, but more importantly, called to outline what action he intends to take to undermine the damage.
Just suggest inadvertently.
Inadvertently misled the House. And so I would like to know, can the Prime Minister be called to apologise for inadvertently misleading the House? And secondly, outline what steps he intends to take to undo the damage which the change in the Act of Union has caused constitutionally and economically to Northern Ireland.
Can I first of all say I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving me notice of his point of order. The honourable member raises the issue of legal interpretation, which are not a matter